everyone and welcome to my studio. I'm Diane and today we're going to talk about a subject which is one of those very highly debated subjects and topics which cause a great deal of disagreement between artists and beginners and experts alike. And that is the subject of paper stretching. Now, I don't always stretch my paper, and the first thing I want to say is that is because I don't always paint on very large sheets of paper. If you only paint on paper which is perhaps a maximum of this size, which is about 10 by 12, then you can often get away without it. But if you paint on larger sheets, you do need to stretch your paper in some way. If you have a large piece of paper like this, which is 16 by 12, and if you paint wet in wet, so you wet the whole sheet first, it will buckle. So when you try to paint on it, you're going to have pooling in the dips, and that's what's going to happen, even if you tape it down using this, which is painter's tape, that is to say decorator's tape. That's masking tape. It's fine if you're going to be working on a small piece of paper, for example this kind of size, which is 8 by 6. If you're working on this kind of size, then tape it down with masking tape, and you shouldn't have too much of a problem. Although if you do use a lot of water and you wet the whole thing to do a wet in wet sky, for example, you probably will get some rippling effect, but you can probably live with that. So I'm going to show you the method that I use today for stretching paper when I'm going to be using it stretched. And the first thing you have to think about is the board that you're going to use to stretch onto. And that needs to be a rigid board. That's very important. You can't use a piece of cardboard like this. This is the backing sheet from an old pad. It's quite thick cardboard though, but it flexes. So when you stretch the paper, if you stretched it and stuck it down on cardboard, what will happen is when the paper dries, of course, it will stretch. When it's wet, when it dries, it shrinks and it will bend the board. So that won't work. So we discard that as an option. You can use plywood. This is thin plywood. I don't know, 1/8 of an inch thick plywood. Quite hard, rigid, totally stiff, won't bend. That's perfect. It's quite light. That's ideal. So if you have a piece of flat, smooth plywood, that would work well. This is some kind of composite board. I use this when I'm painting in oil or acrylic sometimes. I think it's mason board. I don't know if you call it that. I think so. That's sort of okay, but it does flex a bit. That's a good thing with plywood, because in plywood it's made from wood that has a grain going this way and other sheets go that way, so it doesn't bend at all. But this does bend a bit, so that's better than cardboard but not as good as plywood. And this is chipboard, composite chipboard. That's also incredibly rigid and solid, and that works perfectly as long as it's reasonably thick. It needs to be at least 1/4 of an inch thick. Probably better to be as thick as this, which is, where's my ruler? That's just under 1 centimetre, or just over 3/8 of an inch. So that would work well too. Another option would be this. This is hardboard, which is from the back of a painting. A frame rather, and that would be absolutely no use. Be fine to put a piece of paper on and tape it down using masking tape, but not if you're going to stretch it, because this flexes, so that's no good either. And this is a piece of foam core, and that's rigid and that's very, very light, and this is okay if you can make your tape stick to it. A lot of people use this for stretching if they use staples, and I have never done that, so I won't express any opinion on that, so I don't know about that method. I've always shied away from the idea of stapling the paper down because it seems to me it's likely to tear, but I have absolutely no experience of that myself whatsoever. I'm just mentioning it, that it is an option. Maybe I'll try it out and see how it works out at some point. Anyway, I think that would work fine for the taping method as well, because that is actually quite rigid. But my preferred choice myself is plywood like this, which is really a good surface to stretch onto. And first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to give it a wipe to make sure that it's reasonably clean and to wet it down a little bit. It's a good idea to get rid of any remnants of paint from previous painting sessions or whatever, so we'll do that. And I'm not going to bother to dry it because I want it to be wet. Okay, so that's nice and clean now. I'm just using a little sponge here to do that with, nothing special. And I'm going to show you how to stretch a piece of paper which is fairly thin. Now, one of the things with watercolour paper, this is not 140 pounds. This is probably 90 pounds, but it is watercolour paper and it does work quite well. But because it's only 90 pounds, it buckles when it's wet. However, if you stretch it, you can use it as if it were thicker paper. So it's really a good way of being economical if you're trying to save a bit of money. So what you do is you put your piece of paper down on the board and then you wet it all over with your sponge. And what this is doing is it is going to break down the sizing on the paper a little bit so that it makes it easier to paint with. So you just go over the whole piece of paper like that and then just leave it for a few minutes to settle, during which time you can take your roll of brown paper tape. This is packing tape. You can buy it from any stationery store. It's brown paper on one side, glued on the other side, and this one's quite nice and wide, so it should stick really well. Now, there is absolutely no mystique to this. You wet your paper on both sides. You make sure there are no bubbles in the surface of the paper. You make sure there are no puddles, and then you take your paper tape and you just wet it. Make sure it's wetted all along, and then you apply it to your paper, press it down, and then do the next side. Same deal. Tear off a piece of paper, tape, put it in position, press it down. The only snag you'll ever have really with doing this is if your paper tape isn't very gluey, and you might have a problem then with it not sticking. But when you get a nice wide piece like this, you don't want the very narrow, otherwise there's not enough space for it to grip onto the paper. So there we are, we just press that down all around with some tissue to take off any excess water. Now when you have done this, you might see a few bubbles occurring there in the middle of the paper. There's a few bits on there from the sponge which looks like it's going to need to be replaced. But the bubbles don't matter, just leave it, and as it dries those bubbles will disappear. Okay, and so when it's dry, the paper will shrink back down again and it will be tight, and it will provide you with a very good painting surface. You can speed the process up by using a hairdryer on it, but it's not a good idea. I've found that I've spoilt I don't know how many times I've done that because I've been in a hurry and it's caused the tape to separate from the paper. And if that happens, then you've wasted your time. You need to start all over again. So I'll put that aside and leave that to dry. And then when I come back, it's a good idea to, for example, if you know you're going to do some painting the next day, to stretch your paper the night before when you're just about to leave your studio. Just spend 5 minutes doing that. Then when you come back in the morning, you've got a nicely stretched piece of paper ready to go. So there we are. That's how you stretch paper. And that's why you stretch paper. Several reasons, I'll just go over those again. First of all, if you stretch lightweight paper, say 90-pound paper, which will buckle if you put a lot of water on it. It will buckle even if you put a little bit of water on it effectively, but you can use 90-pound paper as if it were more expensive, thicker paper if you first stretch it. The second reason is that when you've stretched your paper and you've painted on stretched paper, you will appreciate the difference between painting on stretched and unstretched paper. The sense of painting on something that has been tightly stretched is completely different, and if you want to do a really nice painting, especially landscapes, you'll benefit enormously from painting on stretched paper. And if you're going to do a large painting, that is to say maybe a half imperial, that big sheet of paper, if you're going to paint on that size, you don't have any choice. You have to stretch it, otherwise it will just go completely mad, and so will you. Unless you're using 300-pound paper, in which case that's a completely different kettle of fish. So there we are. I'll leave it there. You can make up your own mind about this, obviously, as no doubt you will, as everyone does. That's my 2 cents worth of reasons why stretching paper can be a beneficial thing to do, but it's obviously not obligatory. Bye everybody, thanks for being here. See you soon. Bye bye.